Imagine this for a second. You just dropped hundreds of dollars on a piece of high-end, beautifully engineered hardware.
Right.
You set it up in your living room. You marvel at the sleek design, the processing power, just the sheer potential humming inside that plastic shell.
Yeah, it's a premium machine.
Exactly. But to truly unlock its full potential, to gain absolute unrestricted control over what this machine can actually do, you don't just flip a convenient switch in a settings menu.
I wish it were that easy.
Right, no. Instead, you have to launch a heavily modified version of the YouTube app.
Yep.
You have to physically walk over to your wall and unplug your Wi-Fi router.
Which is just crazy to think about.
It really is. And then you have to sit there on your couch staring at a tiny moving progress bar on your screen for exactly 50 minutes.
50 minutes of pure anxiety.
Yeah, just holding your breath and praying that the entire operating system doesn't suddenly implode, forcing you to start the whole maddening process all over again. Welcome to the absolute bleeding edge of console modification.
It genuinely sounds like a digital hostage situation when you frame it like that.
It does.
But, I mean, this is the uncompromising reality of the scene right now. The lengths people will go to in order to break down these walled gardens are just staggering.
Totally. So today we are wading deep into the complex, highly fragmented and rapidly evolving world of PlayStation 5 jailbreaking. Specifically, we are looking at the landscape as it stands right now in May 2026.
And it is a messy landscape.
Oh, absolutely. And to figure out how and why people are putting themselves through this, we have a massive stack of sources for today's deep dive.
You really do.
Yeah, we're pulling from some highly technical GitHub repositories. Specifically, we're looking at the incredibly dense documentation from developers going by Matem6 and itsPLK.
Which, those docs are not light reading.
No, not at all. We've also got a really detailed YouTube tutorial from the channel Gamings, which is great because it shows us the actual visual reality of this process.
Right. Seeing it happen is totally different from reading the code.
Exactly. And perhaps most revealing of all, we are diving into several incredibly active, deeply frustrated, and occasionally triumphant Reddit threads from the PS5 Jailbreak community.
Those community threads are the real treasure here, honestly.
Yeah.
Because, technical documentation on GitHub tells us the mathematical theory of how these exploits are supposed to function in a sterile environment.
Like in a lab.
Exactly. But the Reddit threads, they show us the brutal, boots-on-the-ground reality of actually trying to execute that math in a noisy, imperfect living room.
That makes total sense. So our mission today is to decode this landscape for you. We want to help you understand where the community stands right now, decode the fascinating, almost mind-bending technical mechanics of how these specific exploits actually break the console security architecture.
Which is wild, by the way.
It really is. And finally, highlight the obsessive community effort required to make these modifications even remotely stable. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the wild 50-minute exploits involving video streaming apps, we have to look at the battlefield itself. We need to understand the firmware ecosystem.
Right.
Because it completely dictates your experience.
It does. To understand the firmware landscape, you have to understand the fundamental dynamic of this whole subculture.
Which is?
Well, if there is one unbreakable golden rule in the console modification community, it is this: stay offline. And under no circumstances should you ever update your firmware.
Never.
Never. Because an update isn't just, a fun new menu theme or a minor bug fix.
Right, it's not just quality of life stuff, it's a targeted weapon.
Exactly. It's an active countermeasure. Sony and these independent developers are locked in this perpetual game of cat-mouse.
So how does that cycle work practically?
Well, when a developer finds a tiny crack in the console's digital armor, they widen it into an exploit. Then Sony security engineers inevitably analyze that exploit. They figure out exactly how the door was picked, and they issue a firmware update that changes the locks and reinforces the armor.
So they just patch it out?
Yep. And because of this constant back and forth, your ability to liberate your hardware depends entirely on what specific software version your console happened to be running the day you took it offline.
The day you essentially froze it in time.
Precisely. So, as of May 2026, the community has essentially divided the firmware landscape into distinct historical eras.
Okay, let's trace that history, starting from the very bottom, the oldest consoles out there. We're talking firmware versions 3.XX up to 4.51. The community treats this tier like it's some sort of mythological artifact.
Oh, they do. For a very specific subset of power users, firmware 4.51 is the promised land.
Really? Why is that?
The reason is that these early firmwares contain a hypervisor exploit.
Okay, hold on. Let me make sure I actually understand this, because hypervisor is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but what is it actually doing inside the machine?
Right, sounds like sci-fi jargon. Think of the hypervisor as the God-level traffic cop of the system's physical hardware.
God-level traffic cop. I like that.
In a modern computing architecture, the operating system, the thing you actually interact with, doesn't talk directly to the CPU or the RAM.
Wait, it doesn't?
No, it talks to the hypervisor, and the hypervisor allocates those resources safely. It's the ultimate authority.
Okay.
So because an exploit exists at that foundational level on those older firmwares, you have total hardware dominance.
Meaning what exactly?
It enables full, unrestricted Linux support.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you can literally install a desktop operating system and turn your PS5 into a fully functional high-end PC.
That's insane.
It is, but finding a console that has been sitting in a closet, untouched and offline since firmware 4.51 is incredibly rare in 2026.
Yeah, I imagine those are going for crazy prices online.
Oh, absolutely.
So if you don't have the mythological artifact, you might fall into the next tier, which the community refers to as the sweet spot. This covers firmwares up to 10.01. Why is this specific window so highly regarded if it doesn't have that God-level hypervisor exploit?
It comes down to friction, or rather the lack of it. On firmware 10.01 and below, the community has established highly reliable entry points.
Meaning it doesn't crash constantly.
Exactly. And more importantly, there is robust established support for essential payloads like K stuff and etahen.
Okay, let's define payload here for anyone who isn't a cybersecurity expert. Because if the exploit is the crowbar that breaks the lock on the door,
Yes.
then the payload is the actual equipment you carry inside the building to do the work.
All right. That's a really good way to look at it. The exploit just gives you access. The payload is the custom code you inject to actually manipulate the system once you're in.
So what do kstuff and etahen actually do?
Well, kstuff, for instance, is a kernel-level payload that intercepts how the system validates digital signatures.
Okay, and why do we care about digital signature?
Because that's what allows you to run backup copies of games. The system checks if the game is legit. And kstuff basically says, yep, it's legit, even when it's not.
Got it.
And then etahen is basically an all-in-one homebrew enabler that bundles a lot of these tools together.
Mm-hmm.
So if your console's on 10.01, injecting these payloads is relatively quick, the success rate is super high, and the console generally behaves itself without randomly crashing.
So it's smooth.
Very. It's the closest thing to a consumer-friendly, plug-and-play jailbreak experience available.
Okay, but I'm looking at the timeline here, and if you missed that boat, if you connected to Wi-Fi a few too many times over the years, you find yourself in the 10.20 to 12.00 range.
Yeah.
And the sources note that while this is technically possible to jailbreak, it's a massive headache.
It is incredibly convoluted. In this firmware window, Sony successfully patched all those easy entry points we just talked about.
So the easy doors are locked.
Yep. So to get a foot in the door, you have to use what the community calls an expensive userland entry point.
Expensive in terms of money or effort?
A bit of both, honestly. For this specific era, the community discovered a vulnerability in the way a classic PS2 game, specifically, Star Wars Racer Revenge, handles Lua scripts when it runs on the modern console.
Wait.
Yeah.
I am stuck on this detail. You are telling me that to hack a state-of-the-art supercomputer in 2026, you have to go buy a digital copy of a pod racing game from the early 2000s?
Yes. They call this exploit chain Lua Core.
How does that even work? That sounds completely absurd.
It is absurd, but it highlights how creative these developers have to be. When Sony ports a legacy game to the new console, they use an emulator, right?
Right.
Emulators are really complex software, and they often carry their own unique blind spots. In this case, the way the emulator processed Lua, which is a lightweight programming language often used for game logic, had a flaw.
Okay, so the flaw is in the emulator, not the game itself.
Exactly. Hackers figured out how to write a maliciously crafted Lua script, hide it inside a modified game save file. Yeah, and when the game tries to load that save, the script executes and actually breaks out of the game's boundaries.
That's wild, but it means you actually have to own and launch this specific Star Wars game every single time you want to jailbreak your console?
Every single time.
Which is wildly inconvenient.
Extremely.
But even that inconvenience seems like a luxury compared to the current frontier, the absolute leading edge. Firmware's 12.00 up to 12.7 this is where our deep dive is really focused today.
Yes, the frontier.
According to the Reddit wrap-ups, there is no official fast release yet for this tier. What does exist is an exploit chain using YouTube or Netflix, but the catch is that it literally takes hours to run.
And this brings us to a crucial distinction in cybersecurity that dictates why this takes so long. We need to clearly separate a user-land exploit from a kernel exploit.
Right, okay, so if I'm trying to visualize this, let's say the console's operating system is a highly secure office building.
Okay, I like that.
So a user land exploit is like sneaking into the lobby using a fake ID. You're physically in the building, you can walk around the reception area, maybe read a magazine on the couch.
Right.
But you absolutely cannot access the elevators or the filing cabinets containing the sensitive data.
Exactly.
A kernel exploit, on the other hand, is like sneaking into the security room, knocking out the guard, taking his master keys, and shutting off all the cameras. You now own the entire building.
That analogy works perfectly. The YouTube app, the Netflix app, or even the Star Wars game we just talked about.
Yeah.
Those are your fake IDs.
They just get you in the door.
Right. They get you into the lobby. They allow you to execute some arbitrary code within the highly restricted sandbox of that specific application. But modern security architecture is designed so that even if a single app is completely compromised, the core operating system, the kernel, remains totally isolated and secure.
So they keep the lobby completely walled off from the rest of the building.
Yes. To truly jailbreak the console, you cannot just sit in the lobby. You have to use your foothold in the user land to launch a secondary, much more complex attack against the kernel itself.
Okay, before we dissect how they actually launched that attack from the lobby, what about the people who updated past 12.7? Like the folks sitting on 13.00 or the latest 13.20?
Oh, they're out of luck for the foreseeable future.
Completely out of luck.
Completely. A developer named Gazine actually found a zero-day exploit for those newer firmwares. But in a move that highlights how professionalized cybersecurity has become, Gazine reported it to Sony's official bug bounty program.
Wait, what? So the person who finds the hack just hands it over to the manufacturer?
Yeah.
Why would they do that instead of releasing it to the community?
Because bug bounty programs pay substantial amounts of money.
Ah, money talks.
Exactly. Companies like Sony offer massive financial rewards for researchers who responsibly disclose vulnerabilities so they can be patched before they are weaponized. Once Gazine submitted it to the bounty program, it became locked behind strict non-disclosure agreements.
So Sony has it.
Sony is aware of it, they're patching it, and the public will likely never see it.
Which really underscores the life or death stakes of simply leaving your console connected to the internet.
It really does.
If you are on 12.70 and your router accidentally pushes an auto update overnight, you don't just lose your current jailbreak. You are banished to the highest firmware, and you might be waiting years for another developer to find a new vulnerability.
You are entirely locked out. This is why the community treats network settings with such extreme paranoia. Oh, and before we move on, we should also highlight a fascinating hardware divide in this landscape.
Oh, right, the disk versus digital thing.
Yes. The community vastly prefers the physical disk edition of the console over the digital-only edition.
Why is that? I would think the digital edition is just the exact same computer, just without a disk drive. It shouldn't change the software vulnerability, should it?
It changes the physical attack surface.
How so?
Well, the disk edition has a Blu-ray drive, and interactive Blu-ray movie menus are actually powered by Java.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that Java implementation has its own historical vulnerabilities. It provides an entirely separate physical entry point into the user land called BDJB Blu-ray Java Jailbreak.
So it's another fake ID for the lobby.
Exactly. If you have the digital edition, that door physically does not exist, which severely limits your options if Sony patches the network-based apps.
Okay, so the battle lines are drawn. We know the 12.00 to 12.70 firmware frontier is the hardest nut to crack right now.
Yep.
Let's look at how developers are actually breaking through using a simple video streaming app. This brings us to the exploits themselves, Y2JB and P2JB.
Right. Y2JB stands for YouTube Jailbreak. This is the userland framework, the fake ID that gets us into the lobby. It relies on a modified version of the YouTube PV app. Specifically, it attacks the V8 JavaScript engine that the app uses to render its interface.
I want to pause here. Why is a video player using a JavaScript engine? Isn't JavaScript what web browsers use to load interactive websites?
Exactly. And that is the inherent weakness of modern smart devices. To make these apps easy to build and update, developers essentially build them as specialized web browsers.
So the YouTube app is basically just a website running in a box.
Yes, it's largely just a web wrapper. V8 is Google's open-source JavaScript engine. It takes human-readable JavaScript code and compiles it into machine code on the fly so the processor can execute it quickly.
Okay, compiling on the fly.
Right. But to do that just-in-time compilation, the engine requires memory spaces that are simultaneously writable and executable.
Writable and executable. That sounds bad.
In the world of cybersecurity, allowing memory to be both written to and executed is incredibly dangerous.
Because if you can write to it, you can put bad stuff there, and if it executes, the bad stuff runs.
Exactly. By feeding maliciously crafted JavaScript into that V8 engine, the developers can manipulate that memory and gain their foothold in the lobby.
Okay, so we've hacked the web browser, hiding inside the YouTube app. We are standing in the lobby. Now we need the kernel exploit to take over the security room. That is P2JB.
Right. P2JB is the heavy artillery. The version heavily discussed in our sources was ported to these newer firmwares by a developer named Matem6. If you read the GitHub documentation for this, it is staggering.
Oh, it is.
The vulnerability it targets is called a QA creef overflow.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the mechanics of this are completely mind-bending.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
When people picture hacking, they usually picture someone furiously typing on a keyboard, finding a secret backdoor password, and slipping through instantly.
Right, like in the movies.
Exactly. But reading through the GitHub notes, this isn't a backdoor at all. It's a slow, agonizing mathematical siege.
It is a war of attrition against a single integer counter.
Let me try to break down what's actually happening, and you tell me if I have this right.
Go for it.
The payload, which is running inside our compromised YouTube app lobby, starts making a specific request to the console's kernel. It's a system called QGE. And the payload just makes this exact same request over and over and over again.
Yep, just hammering it.
And how many times does it do this? Approximately 4.2 billion times.
To be mathematically exact, it is 2 to the power of 32 times.
Right. It's a 32-bit integer overflow. To visualize this, imagine you were trying to break a massive, indestructible digital dam.
Okay.
But you don't have dynamite, you don't have a wrecking ball, you just have a single eyedropper.
A single eyedropper. I love that.
And the dam has an internal digital counter that tracks how much water is inside, but the computer chip running that counter has a hard physical limit. Because it's a 32-bit system, it can only count up to roughly 4.2 billion.
Right.
So the exploit just drips water into the dam, one single drop at a time, for 50 minutes straight. It waits for the counter to hit exactly 4,294,967,295.
The absolute limit.
Exactly. And then when that very next final drop falls, the counter physically cannot display a higher number. So it rolls over back to 0.
What's fascinating here is that it's not a swift, clever trick. It's a brute force mathematical inevitability based on the limitations of silicon architecture.
It just physically can't count higher.
Right. When that counter rolls back to 0, the console's kernel looks at the counter, sees a 0, and says, oh, this specific space in memory must be empty now. I can free it up for other applications to use.
But the memory isn't actually empty.
No, it's not. The exploit is still actively occupying it. This creates what is known in cybersecurity as a use-after-free vulnerability.
I want to make sure the use-after-free concept is clear, because it seems central to everything they're doing here.
It is the core of the attack.
So if I use a hotel analogy, it's like a guest checks out of room 204. The front desk clerk marks the room as free in the computer system.
Okay.
But the guest secretly made a copy of the key and is hiding under the bed. The hotel thinks the room is empty and secure. So when the kernel checks into room 204, the hacker is already inside, waiting to attack.
That is a brilliant way to explain it. The system believes that sector of RAM is unallocated, but the malicious code is still lingering there, waiting to interact with whatever privileged data the system drops into that space next.
So it's essentially an ambush.
Exactly.
Yeah.
From that point, the GitHub documentation details how the exploit leverages that hidden presence to build a read-write primitive.
What does a read-write primitive actually allow them to do?
It means they can now arbitrarily read and alter the core memory of the console's operating system.
So they have the master keys now.
Yes. They escalate the host process, our YouTube app, to root privileges. And then they do something truly audacious.
What's that?
They literally rewrite a segment of the kernel memory using GPU direct memory access.
Well, wait, why the GPU? Why are they using the graphics card to rewrite the operating system's memory?
Because the main CPU is heavily guarded by security mitigations. But the graphics processing unit, by design, needs incredibly fast direct pipes to the system's memory to render complex visuals without lagging.
Because games need to load graphics instantly.
Right. So the hackers trick the GPU into thinking it's drawing a pixel on the screen, but instead it is firing a specific instruction directly into the kernel's memory space, forcibly enabling the hidden debug settings menu.
That is wild.
It is an absolute masterclass in repurposing hardware to bypass software locks.
And the final step of that 50-minute eyedropper siege is delivering what the sources call an ELF loader.
Right. ELF stands for Executable and Linkable Format. It's simply a standard file format for executable programs.
Okay.
The exploit sets up a listener program on the console's local network, specifically listening on TCP port 9021.
Port 9021.
Yes. The console is now sitting there, fully unlocked, with its defenses down, actively waiting for you to send it custom executable code over your home Wi-Fi network.
I have a massive logistical question here.
Sure, go ahead.
If this ELF loader, this receiver, is living inside the YouTube app's process, because that's where we started this whole chain, right?
Yep, it's still in the lobby.
What happens if I'm done hacking and I just want to sit down and play Spider-Man, I close YouTube, and launch a game? Does the jailbreak survive?
That is the crucial, frustrating limitation of this specific method. If you just hit the home button and close the YouTube app, the console's operating system does its job.
Which is to clean up.
Exactly. It clears all the memory that the YouTube app was using to free up resources for your game. In doing so, it destroys your ELF loader.
Oh, no.
You lose your connection, and the jailbreak collapses. This is why the community relies on what they call persistent payloads.
So you have to anchor it somehow.
Exactly. Before you ever close YouTube, you have to use that open port 9021 to send a payload that embeds itself deeper into the system's architecture, patching things in a way that survives the app being forcefully closed.
What kind of payload does that?
A popular one they use is BDUNJB, which ironically unpatches the Blu-ray drive vulnerabilities we mentioned earlier to gain a permanent foothold.
That's clever.
Only after you've set up a permanent camp outside of the YouTube app's memory space can you safely close the video player without the console immediately crashing or losing its jailbroken state.
Okay, so the math is brilliant. The technical execution of the integer overflow and the GPU memory access is flawless in theory.
In theory, yes.
But we have to talk about the reality, because understanding the math is one thing. Actually living through a 50-minute exploit in your living room is entirely different, which leads us to the stability struggle.
Oh, it is a struggle. It requires a level of patience that, frankly, most modern consumers simply do not possess.
I certainly don't.
Right. We are used to instant gratification from our technology.
Yeah.
Staring at a screen for an hour is agonizing.
We were reading through the PS5 Jailbreak subreddit, and the frustration is just palpable. It bleeds through the screen. People are literally pulling their hair out.
In a very stressful environment.
One user, Catiox, started a massive thread noting that the success rate is incredibly low. They said, and I quote, "It takes almost a whole day trying to get it working."
And that's the rub. It's not just a guaranteed 50-minute wait. It's a 50-minute wait with a notoriously high chance of catastrophic failure at the very last second.
Which is devastating.
The Reddit consensus suggests that for many users, this process only succeeds about 1 out of every 3 attempts.
And what actually happens when it fails? Because it doesn't just give you a polite pop-up error message saying, "Oops, try again."
No. It triggers a kernel panic, often abbreviated as a KP.
A kernel panic.
Yes. A kernel panic is a modern operating system's final, desperate mechanism for dealing with a completely unrecoverable internal error.
Basically the system throwing its hands up.
Exactly. Remember that we are dealing with a highly precarious 32-bit integer overflow. If that memory isn't aligned absolutely perfectly when the counter rolls over, or if a background system process tries to use that memory at the exact wrong microsecond, the kernel detects deep data corruption.
And what does it do?
To protect the physical hardware and prevent the corruption from writing bad data to your hard drive, it instantly, forcefully shuts the entire system down. It is a hard, violently sudden crash.
The screen just goes black.
Yep.
The console completely dies. And then when you manually walk over and press the power button to turn it back on, it doesn't just boot up normally, does it?
No, it boots into safe mode and forces you to sit through a lengthy storage repair sequence because the solid-state drive wasn't shut down properly.
It is terrifying the first few times it happens. You genuinely think you've permanently destroyed your expensive machine.
And then, after the database repair finally finishes, you have to open the YouTube app and start the 50-minute timer all over again.
Knowing it might just crash again.
Exactly.
Because this process is so grueling, users obviously try to find shortcuts. The most common one mentioned on Reddit is trying to use the PS5's rest mode.
Which is totally understandable.
The logic makes sense, right? You suffer through the 50-minute jailbreak once, you get it perfectly stable, and then instead of turning the console completely off when you're done playing, you just put it to sleep.
Which actually works beautifully on the older, lower firmwares.
Yo, it does.
Yeah. But on the 12.0 to 12.70 tier, it is a nightmare. The Reddit threads are full of users, Catiox, City80, Bluebic, all reporting the exact same depressing phenomenon.
What happens?
You wake the console from rest mode, the lights pulse, you try to launch a game, and boom, instant kernel panic. Screen goes black, no HDMI signal, and you're forced to hard reboot.
Why is rest mode so fundamentally broken on these specific firmwares? If the system is asleep, shouldn't the memory just stay exactly as it was?
It comes down to how memory is managed during the suspend and resume cycle. When the console goes to sleep, it suspends its RAM to save power.
Okay.
But remember, this jailbreak relies on an incredibly delicate use-after-freeze state and active temporary patches to the kernel memory. Waking up the hardware is actually a highly complex operation. The system has to reinitialize the graphics drivers, reestablish network connections, and spin up the background services.
So it's busy.
Very. This causes a massive, sudden spike in kernel activity. Those delicate patches in the RAM get overwritten, or they trip over legitimate system processes that are waking up, and the kernel panics to save itself.
I have a seemingly obvious question, but I need to understand why they can't do this.
Yeah.
If this 50-minute process in RAM is so incredibly unstable, why don't developers just save the state of the jailbreak to the PS5's ultra-fast solid-state drive? Just write the patched kernel files to the hard drive so that when you reboot the console, it just loads the hacked version permanently, and you never have to do the 50-minute wait again.
That's a very logical question, and it's actually the holy grail of hacking. It's known as a custom firmware, or CFW.
Custom firmware, right.
But it hits the fundamental wall of modern console security architecture. You're dealing with the difference between volatile memory, the RAM, and non-volatile storage, the hard drive.
Volatile meaning it disappears when the power turns off.
Precisely. Let's use an analogy. RAM is like a whiteboard. You can write incredibly complex math problems on it, but the moment you turn off the lights, the whiteboard is wiped completely clean.
Makes sense.
The solid-state drive is like a printed textbook. The information is permanent. Sony's chain of trust security architecture ensures that every single time the console boots up from the powered-off state, a tiny, unchangeable piece of hardware called the boot ROM checks the cryptographic signatures of the operating system stored on the hard drive.
So it's looking at the textbook.
It essentially uses a blacklight to check the textbook for any signs of forgery.
So it's constantly checking its own ID to make sure it hasn't been tampered with while it was turned off.
Exactly. If a developer tried to permanently alter the core files on the hard drive, the console would detect the tampering during the very next boot sequence. The signature wouldn't match, and the system would simply refuse to turn on.
So you'd be stuck.
You would be left with a very expensive, very heavy plastic brick. So the developers cannot touch the hard drive. They can only attack the whiteboard, the RAM, while the system is actively running.
Wow.
And as Madam6 noted in their GitHub documentation, this specific exploit relies on a triple-free point of no return. Once you manipulate the kernel and RAM, you cannot cleanly undo it or rerun the exploit. If it fails or if you reboot the console, the whiteboard is wiped clean. You are back to square one.
Which means we are stuck with the volatile memory, and we are stuck with the 50-minute wait.
Unfortunately.
But reading through the GitHub documentation, there is actually a fascinating trade-off you can make to improve your chances. It's a process that developers call tuning the leak.
This is where the software engineering gets really granular. The PS5's processor is a multi-core beast. By default, the P2JB exploit utilizes 4 of those CPU cores simultaneously to hammer the kernel with those 4.2 billion system calls.
So it's using 4 different pathways.
It assigns workers to cores 0 through 3, leaving core 4 free to orchestrate the entire process.
And using 4 cores is the fastest method, taking about 50 minutes.
It is the fastest, but as the documentation explicitly points out, it is also the least stable.
Wait, why does using more processing power make it crash more often? Shouldn't more cores just get the math done faster and cleaner?
You would think so, but in a highly restricted kernel environment, it creates a phenomenon known as resource contention.
Resource contention.
When you have 4 separate CPU cores, all screaming at the kernel's memory allocator at the exact same microsecond, aggressively trying to push that counter to the 32-bit limit, You create race conditions. The system gets congested.
Like a traffic jam.
Exactly. A legitimate background process might try to allocate memory at the exact wrong moment. The four exploit threads trip over each other, trying to write to the same space, and the system panics before the overflow can cleanly complete.
So what's the alternative? How do you tune it?
You open the JavaScript file of the payload on your PC and manually edit the code to use fewer cores. If you drop it down to just one single core, it eliminates almost all of that multi-threaded contention.
It's like taking a chaotic, shoulder-to-shoulder mob of people trying to smash through a set of double doors and forcing them to line up in a single file line. It's much more orderly.
Exactly. A single file line isn't going to break the doors off the hinges prematurely. The trade-off, however, is time.
How much time?
A single core leak takes approximately 2 full hours to complete.
2 hours.
2 hours.
Yeah.
But it is vastly more stable.
2 hours of staring at a screen, completely paralyzed, unable to use the console. You can see why the community is desperate for any kind of visual feedback to know the system hasn't secretly frozen 90 minutes in.
Oh, absolutely. You need to know it's still alive.
One user on GitHub, Gooster4, actually praised the developer for coding an OLED-savvy progress bar.
I saw that.
To prevent screen burn-in on expensive OLED TVs during the hour-long wait, the tiny progress bar slowly moves around the screen, updating its position once a minute. The user even half-jokingly suggested they should make it bounce around the edges of the screen like the old DVD player logo.
It's a funny detail, but it highlights the immense psychological toll of this process. You're sitting in your living room, watching a tiny digital bar slowly traverse a black screen, constantly wondering if your expensive console is going to abruptly shut down.
And when failure rates are this high and the time penalty is this severe, desperation breeds invention.
It always does.
When technology is this opaque, the community starts experimenting wildly. And some of it feels like brilliant software engineering, while other parts feel like pure, unadulterated digital superstition.
It is entirely human nature. When we are faced with a random, unpredictable outcome that we don't fully understand, we look for patterns even if they aren't there. But in this case, some of the bizarre patterns the community noticed were actually grounded in deep, hidden system mechanics.
Let's talk about the pipes master metric, because this blew my mind. This is something highlighted heavily in the YouTube tutorial by Gamings, and it is debated constantly on the Reddit threads. When you launch the modified YouTube app, before the 50-minute jailbreak even officially starts, there is a small diagnostic number displayed on the screen labeled Pipes Master.
Right. And users quickly realized this seemingly random number was actually a crystal ball.
Exactly. If a number says 34, 35, or 36, the community consensus is that the jailbreak is almost certainly going to crash at the very end of the 50 minutes. It's doomed from the start.
A dead run.
But if that number is 31, 32, or 33, success is highly likely. One Reddit user, Fukakaka, explicitly laid out the golden rule for newcomers. If you see 34, 35, close the YouTube app. If you see 32, 33, let the jailbreak runs.
It's a brilliant piece of crowdsourced debugging. The community brute forced a metric for success. But the real breakthrough wasn't just observing the number, it was figuring out how to actively manipulate it.
The Wi-Fi trick.
The Wi-Fi trick.
It turns out if you go into your console's network settings and manually uncheck the box to connect to the internet before you run the autoloader, that pipes master number magically drops down to 31 or 32.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it makes perfect technical sense. You have to ask, why does physically disconnecting the Wi-Fi change a memory allocation variable inside a web browser?
Yeah, why?
Because network activity requires constant kernel resources. Every single time the console pings a Sony server in the background to check for a silent firmware update, every time it syncs a trophy or pings your friends list to see who's online, it is allocating memory and executing system calls. It creates fragmentation in the RAM.
Fragmentation, like potholes in a road.
Yes. And the exploit needs a perfectly smooth road. By physically disconnecting the network, you silence all of that background noise. You stop the creation of potholes. You are creating a pristine, contiguous, quiet environment in the system's memory.
That's just cleaner.
Much cleaner. This allows that delicate 50-minute integer overflow to happen sequentially without being interrupted by a random, invisible ping from the PlayStation Network.
It's like trying to build a massive, complex house of cards on a wobbly table. Turning off the Wi-Fi is like asking everyone in the room to stop breathing and step away from the table.
Exactly. And the YouTube tutorial from Gamings demonstrated this in real time. He turned off the network toggle, loaded the app, and the diagnostic number immediately dropped from a doomed 34 down to a stable 31. It drastically, demonstrably improves stability.
But even with a stable environment and the Wi-Fi trick, managing the payloads after the 50 minutes finish was still a massive headache.
Oh, yeah.
You've waited an hour, you absolutely do not want to mess up the final step manually. Enter the developer, itsPLK, who created something called the PS5 Y2JB Autoloader.
This was a massive quality of life improvement for the entire scene. Before this, you had to manually inject files over the network from your PC using a command line Python script every single time the exploit finished.
Which is tedious.
Very. The autoloader automates the entire post-jailbreak process.
How did it actually work in practice?
According to the GitHub repository, once the 50-minute P2JB exploit successfully completes its overflow, the autoloader automatically takes over. It offers two methods. If you haven't configured anything, it launches a payload manager, which is a slick web user interface that lets you click and configure payloads directly from your browser.
That sounds nice.
But the really powerful automated method relies on a simple text file. You create a file named autoload.txt on a standard USB thumb drive, and you plug it into the front of the console.
And in that text file, you just list the names of the payloads you want to run. K, stuff, shadow mount, and FTP server.
Yes, but here is where another piece of incredible community ingenuity comes in. Users were finding that even with the autoloader perfectly configured, the system would sometimes panic right at the finish line.
After all that waiting.
Yep. Why? Because the autoloader was incredibly efficient. It was slamming the system with payloads too fast. Heavy payloads like K-Stuff and Shadow Mount Plus were tripping over each other as they tried to patch the kernel simultaneously.
The delay tactic.
Precisely. The community figured out that you can add a simple syntax to the text file to control the flow. You use an exclamation point followed by a number in milliseconds.
Okay, so
typing .10000 tells the autoloader script to completely pause for 10 full seconds before injecting the next payload on the list. Giving the system 5 to 10 seconds to fully digest and execute each payload completely eliminated those heartbreaking final stage crashes.
it's amazing how much of this highly advanced cybersecurity just boils down to basic digital plumbing. Don't flush all the toilets in the house at the exact same time, or the pipes will burst.
That's pretty much it.
But to actually get these autoloader updates onto the system, you have to update the files inside the hidden partitions of the console. Gaming's detailed this in his video, and it looks exhausting. You obviously can't just download an app update from the official PlayStation Store.
No, because you're offline and blocked from the store. You have to use an FTP payload file transfer protocol. Once you achieve the initial jailbreak, you run an FTP server on the console, usually opening port 2121. Then, you sit at your PC, open a program like FileZilla, and connect directly to the console's IP address.
And then you have to dig through the files manually.
Yes, you have to manually navigate deep into the internal storage structure, specifically routing to user download PPSA01650, which is the hidden directory for the YouTube app.
Just finding that sounds annoying.
And then you manually overwrite a file called download0.dat with the updated modified version.
It is incredibly tedious. And because it's so tedious, and because the stakes of a single crash are a 50-minute penalty, the community definitely leans into superstition.
Oh, completely.
My absolute favorite comment on Reddit was from a user named Husseinry814. He laid out his highly specific, foolproof ritual for success. He said, turn on PlayStation, shut it down, turn it on again, then do jailbreak. Works perfectly fine for the past 10 days without problem.
I love that. It's modern folklore.
It is. Technology at this level, where the average user doesn't fully understand the microscopic processes happening inside the silicon, turns people into superstitious mechanics. It's exactly like blowing into a dusty Nintendo cartridge in the 90s, but applied to a supercomputer.
But again, there is likely a genuine kernel of truth, no pun intended, to his bizarre ritual.
You think so?
Yeah. Turning the console on, shutting it down completely through the menus, and turning it back on ensures that the system cache is entirely cleared. It guarantees there are no suspended apps lingering in memory, and the RAM is as fresh and unfragmented as physically possible before starting the exploit.
So it's not magic, it's just a hard reset.
It feels like voodoo, but it's actually just highly aggressive memory hygiene.
Memory hygiene, I like that term. Okay, so we've covered the brutal firmware fragmentation, the mind-boggling math of the 50-minute overflow, the trauma of kernel panics, the Wi-Fi tricks, the FTP file swapping. It is a mountain of effort. It sounds like a full-time job.
It really does.
Which brings us to the ultimate question, the payoff. What do you actually get for all this suffering? Why are thousands of people on Reddit dedicating days of their lives to this? What is the actual reward for the listener if they manage to pull this off?
Their reward is total hardware liberation. You are taking a closed, highly restricted ecosystem designed specifically to only run software approved, vetted, and sold by Sony, and you are turning it into an open, general-purpose computer that you control.
Let's break down the tangible day-to-day benefits outlined in the PS5 Jailbreak megathread. First and foremost, the most common reason people do this, PS4 backups and FPKGs, which stands for fake packages.
Right, a jailbroken PS5 is essentially the ultimate overpowered PS4. You can run practically any PS4 game backup, but more importantly, because you have kernel access via payloads like KStuff, the community has developed 60 frames per second mods for older PS4 titles that were originally locked at a sluggish 30 FPS by the developers.
Yes, a user named Colin Zeal SE specifically mentioned being incredibly excited to finally play Batman Arkham Knight and Red Dead Redemption 2 at 60 FPS.
Which is huge.
That alone is a massive draw for gamers who want to experience classic titles with modern, smooth performance that the official hardware simply won't allow.
And it goes far beyond just PS4 games. The tools for handling actual PS5 backups have advanced significantly in the last few years. The documentation mentions tools like Items Flow and Shadow Mount.
What do those do?
These are custom applications that allow users to mount and install native PS5 games directly from the internal storage or from massive external USB drives.
Right. There was a user specifically talking about playing Stellar Blade, which is a very recent, graphically intense PS5 exclusive on their jailbroken 12.02 firmware console. Though, to be fair, they were complaining that it kept freezing their console due to weird network errors.
Which highlights the constant caveat of this scene. Not all PS5 dumps are perfectly playable. Sony implements advanced security measures within the games themselves, so developers are constantly finding workarounds. And there is also the incredible feat of backports.
Backward.
Yeah, where developers take a brand new game that officially requires firmware 13.00, they strip out its firmware requirement, and they modify the code so it runs perfectly on an older, jailbroken firmware like 10.01.
That is some impressive engineering. Beyond piracy and game backups, there is the massive homebrew scene.
Yes. Custom applications built by the community, file managers, cheat engines that let you modify game memory in real time, debug tools, and emulators.
Emulators are always popular.
You can run classic Nintendo, Sega, and PlayStation 1 and 2 games on your powerful PS5 hardware. And, as we mentioned earlier, if you were lucky enough to be on the ancient 3.XX or 4.XX firmwares, you get full Linux support.
The hypervisor exploits.
Right. You can literally plug in a USB mouse and keyboard, boot into a Linux desktop environment, run a web browser, edit documents, and use the console as a high-end personal computer.
The level of control is incredible. I also noticed a fascinating note in the itsPLK Autoloader GitHub repository regarding security.
Oh, the local host thing.
Yeah. By default, the custom ELF loader they provide only accepts local host connections.
That's a vital architectural detail. When you intentionally open a port like 9021 on your console to inject code, you are basically leaving the front door of your house wide open and removing the locks.
Right.
If you take that console to a crowded college dorm, or if a malicious actor compromises your home Wi-Fi network, anyone on that network could theoretically inject malicious payloads into your PS5. They could steal data or permanently brick the machine.
That's a scary thought.
It is. The local host restriction means the console is programmed to only accept payloads originating from itself, from the USB drive plugged into it, rather than from the wider network. It shows the community isn't just recklessly focused on breaking things, they are actively engineering secure infrastructure to protect the users.
So when we step back and look at this entire landscape, what does this all mean for the average person? Is this worth hunting down a sealed low firmware console on eBay for double the retail price? Is it worth dedicating hours of your weekend to FTP transfers, editing text files, and staring at OLED progress bars? Or is the average person better off just paying for a PlayStation Plus subscription and calling it a day?
It entirely depends on what kind of user you are and what you value.
Fair.
If you are someone who just wants to turn on your TV after a long day at work, play a few rounds of Call of Duty online with your friends, and have your game saves sync to the cloud seamlessly without thinking about it, absolutely do not jailbreak your console.
Because you lose all of that.
The moment you run these exploits, you are permanently banished from the PlayStation Network. No online multiplayer, no official game updates, no cloud saves, no digital store. You are entirely isolated on a digital island.
But if you are a tinkerer...
If you view corporate hardware restrictions as a personal challenge, if the idea of modifying memory hex codes to squeeze 60 frames per second out of a legacy game deeply excites you, then yes, it is an incredibly rewarding puzzle. It requires extreme patience, it carries the very real risks of data corruption, but the final payoff is absolute, unmitigated ownership of the hardware you paid for.
It really is a fascinating obsessive subculture. Okay, to quickly recap our journey today, we started by looking at the highly fragmented firmware landscape, where updating your console is the ultimate sin and old PS2 games are used as crowbars.
Yeah, that still cracks me up.
We dove deep into the mind-boggling math of P2JB, where a 32-bit counter is slowly, agonizingly overflowed over 50 minutes to trick the kernel into unlocking its doors.
We examined the community's desperate battle for stability, learning how turning off Wi-Fi to stop memory fragmentation and adding 10-second delays to an autoloader script can literally mean the difference between playing a game and suffering a catastrophic kernel panic.
And finally, we look at the reward, hardware liberation, homebrew, and total, uncompromising control over the silicon.
This raises an important question, something for everyone listening to mull over as we wrap up.
Okay, what is it?
These brilliant developers are leveraging completely ordinary, everyday applications, like a standard YouTube TV app utilizing a basic JavaScript engine to systematically tear down the security architecture of a multi-$100 state-of-the-art machine.
Right.
As our consoles, our televisions, our cars, and our smart home devices become increasingly reliant on these complex, interconnected app ecosystems and web wrappers, we have to ask ourselves, are we building walled gardens that are actually inherently impossible to secure?
Wow.
If a simple video player can eventually be manipulated to hand over the master keys to the system's kernel, what does that say about the long-term future of digital security and true digital ownership?
That is a brilliant, slightly terrifying point. The more complex and interconnected the system becomes, the more surface area there is to attack. A web browser in your car might just be the key to the engine.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep poking at the boundaries of the software you use, and never stop exploring the hidden mechanics of the tech that surrounds you every single day. Just remember, if you want to truly unlock it, you might just find yourself sitting in the dark, unplugging your router, and staring at a progress bar for 50 minutes hoping the system doesn't crash. See you next time.